I'm in Key Largo, probably 2015, speaking to my contact there, and she points to this poster on the wall of her office, and she said, that ship used to be a Canadian flagship. And I thought, really? A lot of people in the Royal Canadian Navy, including myself, with my degrees in history and so on, had no idea that HMCS Canada existed. Our goal is making this ship better known. That it wasn't HMCS Niobe, which was Canada's first warship, was actually HMCS Canada.
That's Joseph Frey, expedition leader, underwater explorer, and RCGS vice president. Before there was a Royal Canadian Navy, there was HMCS Canada, a ship that trained Canada's first naval officers. It was a First World War convoy escort. It survived the Halifax Explosion, and today it rests beneath the waters of the Florida Keys. This week, I'm thrilled to have Joseph Frey joining us to tell the remarkable story of Canada's forgotten first warship here on Explore, the Canadian Geographic Podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm your host, David McGuffin. Joseph Frey has had a remarkable career as a Royal Canadian Navy officer, a polar explorer, educator, journalist, archaeologist, and so much more. Joe has also been a director and vice president of the New York-based Explorers Club. In 2014, he was part of the official RCGS team that took part in the successful hunt for the long-lost ships of the Franklin expedition, helping to solve one of the greatest mysteries of the Canadian Arctic and naval history. He's now on a mission to revive the memory of HMCS Canada, a pivotal ship not just in the creation of the Canadian Navy, but in forging the identity of a young Canadian nation. Joe's got a great story to tell, so let's get to it. Joseph Frey, welcome to the Explore podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being invited on your podcast.
Well, it's a real honor to have you here. You're obviously such a cornerstone of the RCGS and all the amazing things that gets done here. And I want to get into some of the things that you're working on right now. But I'm always curious to learn where the explorers we have on the podcast got their spark of adventure. And I'm wondering where it was you grew up and what you were up to as a kid and where this all came from.
When I was quite young, it was going back to the early 60s now, my father took me to an archaeological site in Midland, Ontario, which is Ste. Marie among the Hurons, except now it's been rebuilt as a historic site. But back then it was just an archaeological site. Dr. Wilfred Jury from the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, was running an excavation on the site, and I was just fascinated by the post mills in the ground, and I guess by one of the French-built stone bastions, just looking at the stones in the ground, the foundation stones, and it just grabbed me. And then afterwards, or just around that time, I never liked reading in elementary school. Dick and Jane and Spot. I don't know what you read when you were in elementary school, but Dick and Jane and their dog Spot never really captivated me. But in grade 3, we had this reader, and there was this story about two French guys, Radisson and Groseilliers, and there were hand-drawn pictures of them fighting snowstorms, and they were on horse snowshoes, and then I think they're caught in Iroquois attack. But anyhow, that just captivated me. So I just started falling in love with New France and the history of New France, First Nations history, the Huron-Wendat and Iroquois confederacies, and then the archaeology involved in it, that site at Ste. Marie. And that's what really got me into, really started sinking the hook into me as far as history, geography, archaeology, went anthropology, social anthropology, physical anthropology. Yeah, so that's really early 60s, or 63, 65 would have been what got me going. And then my parents indulged me, and they took me to the various historic sites around Simcoe County, southern Georgian Bay, where the Ontario government had marked Huron-Wyandot villages and other villages that had contact with the French Jesuits and so on. And it got so bad that my mother would start distracting me on the road to, oh, look at that. So I wouldn't notice that there was a sign coming up through historic site.
That's hilarious.
But yeah, that's where it really started for me. And then spending the summers up on Georgian Bay,
Yeah.
swimming and up there. And then at an early age, probably around 5, I got my first set of goggles and stuck my head underwater and started swimming. And then by the age of 15, I started scuba diving. Jacques Cousteau was big then.
Right.
A friend had a tank and a regulator, and he loaned it to myself and another friend of mine, Elliot Rose. And this is 1970. You're just starting scuba diving. So, we just dove by ourselves. We took turns handing the tank off to each other and scuba diving in Georgian Bay without any training, and didn't know you didn't hold your breath on the way back up. And
Ah,
none of these technicalities. But yeah, then I started getting into diving on by 1971, 72. By 71, I'd gotten my Ontario Underwater Council certification. I think it was number 300 and something.
right.
And Elliot and I he had a large boat, and we started going to shipwrecks around Christian Island, Beckwith Island, and southern Georgian Bay. And
Mm.
that's really what captivated me.
One thing that does stand out is obviously you were part of the RCGS involvement in finding the wrecks of the Franklin expedition. So, and you were part of that 2014 crew that
Yeah,
actually
I was part of the 2014 expedition.
found
The
Erebus. Yeah.
RCGS, I think they sent 5 of us on the expedition. You have to understand that was a large expedition. It harks back to the British expedition of 1850, where they sent multiple ships up
Yeah.
looking for Franklin. And so in 2014, there were actually 209 people on that expedition on 5 different vessels, ranging from icebreakers to much smaller vessels, which actually ended up finding HMS Erebus. I think it was called the Thompson. Anyhow, it was a 30-footer that is owned by Parks Canada Underwater Archaeology Team. So we went everything from 30-foot boats to Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker, the Laurier, and yeah, a total of 209 people on that expedition. But I was part of 5 members of the RCGS team. We were on 2 different vessels, and I was involved, with daily planning. We would look at the satellite charts, the ice charts, and then decide where we wanted to go. So the expedition was originally to Search Zone 1, or the North Search Zone. Actually, the North Search Zone was supposed to be was on the west coast of King William Island, and it was so ice clogged that we had to split the expedition up into 2 and then move further south to the South Search Zone off the Adelaide Peninsula. And that's ultimately where we found the ship.
So did you get to see it yourself? Do you lay eyeballs on it when you were?
Not initially, no. It was very hush hush. Very few of us knew that the ship had been found. The protocol was that when the ship was identified by the 2 underwater archaeologists, and then Marc-Andre Bernier, who was the senior underwater archaeologist at the time, decided, yes, based on the evidence found, this is Erebus or Terror. At that point, they already knew it was Erebus based on its size, because
Yeah.
the 2 ships, we have the drawings of the ships, and one ship was larger by 3 feet or 1 meter than the other. So we knew it was Erebus. But so the protocol was we had to shut down all communications on all ships. So all the satellite links are basically cut, not basically, were cut. And there was just one form of communications open for Marc-Andre Bernier on the Laurier. At that point, he had flown to Laurier by helicopter from one ship to another.
Hmm.
And then he let the Prime Minister, then Stephen Harper, know. Stephen Harper then let then British Prime Minister David Cameron know. David Cameron then let his Minister of Defense know, because, of course, at that time, both Erebus and Terror still belonged to the British Royal Navy, so it was their ships. And then once the Minister of Defense knew, he then notified Buckingham Palace, who then notified the Queen, and then the Queen made her statement, which wasn't released at that exact moment.
Yeah.
And then Prime Minister Harper was notified. And then at that point, we were told that we had to scurry out of Cambridge Bay very quickly, had a flight come into Cambridge Bay, pick us up, take us down to Edmonton. And then went from Edmonton to Toronto to Ottawa to be at a press conference the following morning, I think at 9 a.m. So we
Yeah,
left at
wow.
2 p.m. the day before to be in Ottawa for a 9 a.m. press conference. And that's when it was announced to the world.
Just
that
the
really,
history of all of that. Almost as fascinating as the Franklin expedition itself was just all the effort to find it.
oh yeah, if you
And
look
to
at
have
it,
been
I
part of the
think,
expedition that actually found it.
yeah, before the expedition took place, of course, you're doing the media rounds here in Toronto with all the big media outlets, with CBC and Maclean's magazine and other media outlets, and you're being interviewed. And of course, you're saying, oh, yeah, we know we're going to find it because we put in a lot of scientific research and all to this, decades and decades worth of research from various expeditions. Plus, we're engaged with the Canadian Ice Services, and we're looking back at what Parks Canada has narrowed everything down to over the last decade, because they had, I think, 8 previous expeditions to that, looking for Erebus and Terror. And so you built up this very scientific, very logical explanation for it all, but really not quite believing that you would find it, although telling everyone, because of course
Yeah.
you have to be positive. But we were, I think, the 43rd expedition in
Amazing.
168 years to go looking.
Wow.
And my God, we found it.
Yeah.
Well, at least we found one of the two. Yes.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
One led to the other pretty quickly, too. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah, almost two years later, almost to the day, the Terror was found, ironically, in Terror Bay
Yeah, I know.
on King William Island, but it was just a fluke that it was called Terror Bay. It wasn't because
Yeah.
they had an inkling the ship was there. It was just when the Royal Navy was mapping the area and the survey crew came back from a day of doing the mapping of the shoreline and the depth of the water in Terror Bay. My understanding is they asked the officer of the watch, what should we call this place? And he said, oh, Terror Bay.
Yeah. So let's go from one underwater ship to another, I think, here, if we
Okay.
can. So
Definitely.
you've been involved, and this was an RCGS expedition last year with HMCS Canada.
Yes.
And I read a description of HMCS Canada that said before there was a Canadian Navy, there was HMCS Canada. And so can you just tell us a bit about this ship and why it's important to our naval
Yeah,
history?
certainly. Yeah, so really this ship, which started off life as Canadian Government Ship Canada in 1904, and then in 1915 was transferred over to the Royal Canadian Navy and became HMCS Canada. She's really the nucleus of the Canadian Navy. She was built in 1904. She was the only ship of her kind ever built, which helped then identify her years later by underwater archaeologists with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. But she was built. She had a ram bow, which was cutting edge for that time period. She was also the first Canadian warship or government-owned ship made it purely of steel, because ships prior to that were made of iron. There were advances in producing steel, so by the 1890s, you could go from iron to steel fairly inexpensively. And prior to the 1890s, steel was very expensive to manufacture. New manufacturing techniques made it cheaper. So warships now are being made out of steel. And then this is the first Canadian government ship made out of steel, ram bow. She's armed with 4 automatic heavy machine guns, but they're known as Mark III 1.5 pounders.
Yeah.
And so again, for a Canadian government vessel, it was very heavily armed. And she also had twin screw propellers. And so she had a lot of advances for her time. And she was initially used for fishery patrol. She was also used for policing and for training the nucleus of an officers' corps and a petty officers' corps for what already by 1902, 1904, they're already starting to realize that Canada would eventually start developing its own navy.
Because up until this point, the British Navy is basically taking care of our coastal patrols.
So
and that kind of-
1905, the British Royal Navy is still in Canada, in Halifax on the east coast and Esquimalt on the west coast.
And you're into early 20th century Canada. There is a growing sense of nationalism, isn't there, about the nation of Canada? I think
Yeah.
Sir Wilfrid Laurier
definitely.
in the 20th century belongs to Canada and that sort of thing. This seems to be part of that shift, right?
It is very much part of it. In fact, it's the Laurier government that goes forward with the Naval Services Act in 1909 and to create the Canadian Naval Service in 1910, May 4th, 1910. Yeah, so very much it was the Laurier government because Robert Borden's, who is leader of the Conservative Party at the time, Robert Borden, his idea was, yes, we'll contribute money to Britain and to the Royal Navy. And it was Laurier, who was the leader of the Liberal Party at the time, who stated, yes, we will contribute to the empire, to the defense of Britain, but the way we're going to do it is through the
Right.
establishment of a Royal Canadian Navy. And
Right.
that's what we did. And so in 1904, so 1902, at the Colonial Conference, Canada decides, okay, we'll contribute to the defense of the empire, but we're going to build our own ship. So 1904, Vickers in England builds then Canadian government ship Canada. Then we receive the ship in 1904, and she is used for fisheries patrol during the summer months, basically from, I think it was April to December. Then after December, it's just too wild on the North Atlantic. Anyhow, no one's fishing. So
Right.
then she comes in and spends the winters in Halifax. But then in 1905, she's invited to join with the British Royal Navy, first in Bermuda and then down in the Caribbean, to actually start training naval crews.
Right.
And that's where our first 6 Canadian naval officers are trained, and then petty officers, and then more junior ranks as the years go on. And CGS Canada, Canadian Government Ship Canada, is the first ship to actually, non-British warship, to be asked to join the Royal Navy in training exercises. So this was a great honor. So
Yeah.
it showed the seamanship of the Canadian sailors. A lot of the Canadian sailors had been East Coast fishermen and were quite adept at being out at sea. And the ship, like I said, when she was built in 1904, she was the top of her class. And so the British appreciated the fact that it's a small warship, but it's a very effective warship.
Right.
And also the Canadian officers and sailors were quite good.
How would you compare it if you were to compare it to a modern warship now? What is it, a coastal
It would
patrol
be,
ship
yeah,
or
the historical references refer to it as a cruiser. At the time, okay, sure, that was the terminology used, but today a cruiser is a
it's a
large
big,
ship.
yeah.
Basically, it's just one step down from a battleship,
Yeah.
right? She was not a cruiser. She would be more like a torpedo boat. A big torpedo boat at 200 feet in length
Right.
and 25 feet across. But that's what we would see her more as today, more like a corvette. Canada's looking at potentially building corvettes in addition to the 15 destroyers, river class destroyers that we're building.
Mm.
And so Corvette size or slightly smaller than a Corvette.
Yeah. So basically, the winds of war come,
Yeah.
right? And so a Canadian Navy is eventually put together. And this is where Canada gets her HMCS
Yeah.
designation.
So in
Yeah.
1909, Britain announces to the empire that, oh my God, the Germans now are basically, their navy is to the point where it's really threatening us. And German industrial capacity could keep up with British industrial
Yeah.
capacity. And that's what you needed. After the Dreadnought is launched in, was it 1904, 1905?
Hmm.
That changes shipbuilding for everyone. And then it becomes, okay, if you've got the money and the industrial capacity, you can build this massive navy. Germany built a navy which wasn't as large as the Royal Navy, but was very capable. And so the British in 1909 announced that, look, we really need the empire, the dominions to contribute financially. And then by 1905, the British have already pulled out their fleet from Canada. And so Canada then in 1909, when this was shocking news, when Britain admits that it can't do it on its own, Canada then created a Canadian Navy. May 4th, 1910, the Canadian Navy is created. The British loan Canada 2 warships. Our first official warship is HMCS Niobe, which is a British cruiser, and she's based out of Halifax, and the second warship is slightly smaller, but it is another cruiser, HMCS Rainbow, which is posted out of Esquimalt. But it's a Canadian government ship, Canada, that greets Niobe when she enters Halifax Harbor. And then, so the war starts 1914. By 1915, then Canadian government ship Canada is transferred over to the Royal Canadian Navy and becomes His Majesty's Canadian Ship Canada. So then it truly becomes a warship.
Right.
One important factor is in 1912, her bow is rebuilt. Her bow is made higher so she can take heavier seas in the North Atlantic. It also allows her to add more crew members, more space for crew. It also allows her to add larger guns. So in 1912, the bow of the ship, the forecastle of the ship is rebuilt. It's higher. And the 4 Mark III 1.5-pounder guns are removed, and 2 12-pounder artillery pieces are put on the aft deck or on the back of the ship, and 2 3-pounder guns are put on the bow of the ship. So now she becomes a real warship, and so now she can defend against merchant raiders and other lightly armed warships that still pose a threat. So 1912, physically, she does become a warship in the truest sense of the word, more of an upgraded warship with heavier capacity in terms of naval artillery and larger crew, greater seaworthiness. And so she starts in 1912 patrolling Halifax Harbor, engaging in exercises to defend Halifax Harbor, and also in mine-sweeping exercises. And then the war starts, and she leads convoys from Quebec City to Halifax. And then from Halifax on, other convoys take them across the North Atlantic. So she's also used to look out for German U-boats and German merchant raiders off the Canadian coast and off Newfoundland. The British then really need a lot, because a lot of British fishing vessels were pulled into military service. So Britain now relied on Canada for its stocks of fish to eat.
I think when we think of the Atlantic and war in Canada, we really think of World War II, but it was
Yes.
a very similar thing going on in the First World War, though, with the U-boats very effectively taking out shipping and...
No, German U-boat activity brought Britain 3 weeks away from starvation. So the U-boat war did play a big part in both world wars as part of German naval strategy. Churchill decided, so Churchill during the First World War, he was started off the war as first admiral of the fleet.
Yeah.
And so anyhow, he decided that Canada's major contribution to the war would be in terms of the army as opposed to navy. So that's why the Canadian Navy didn't grow as large as it could have, or that one would logically have thought it would have been, because Churchill wanted the Canadians to put more effort into the army, into the land forces,
Western Front,
and fight in the trenches. But in the Second World War, that's no longer the case. And we'll decide where we put our military resources in the Second World War. And that's what we did. And at the end of the Second World War, we ended up with the 3rd largest Navy in the world.
So was it actually involved in action?
Yeah, so it wasn't involved in any
major battles,
any really hardcore action per se, which I guess if you're a crew member, it's a good thing. But she was putting in, I think, 16,000 kilometers on patrol per year. And so while she didn't see actual combat, she still played a very vital role in protecting the convoys, Quebec City to Halifax, but also in protecting the fisheries, the fish, the dried fish that fed the Canadian troops in France and Belgium, the British troops, the British Royal Navy. They came from Canada. Then HMCS Canada during the war still also maintained its role as a training vessel.
Right.
So she was still training officers and men for the Royal Canadian Navy. And so she still played a vital role.
So in 1917, it's in Halifax Harbor when the Halifax explosion comes. And can you tell us
she's
about that?
in Halifax Harbor when the explosion occurred. She's in the naval dockyards, and she survived mainly intact, very little damage to her. No immediate crew members died from the blast. Yeah, so she was one of the few ships that, because when you look at the dockyards and you look at where the Mont Blanc blew up, the 2 ships blew up, the distance isn't that great.
Yeah.
And yeah, so she survived intact, where a
Yeah.
lot of other vessels
Should
were
just say
heavily
it's
damaged.
the biggest man-made explosion ever until Hiroshima, the nuclear
Yeah,
bomb at
yeah, and she
Hiroshima. Yeah.
still is the biggest non-nuclear man-made explosion in
Yeah.
history. Yeah.
Yeah. No, the pictures are crazy.
Oh, it is. And in fact, if you're in Halifax today and you go up on what is now North Halifax,
Mhm.
you can see one side of the road where the buildings are older, and then the other side of the road where the buildings aren't quite as old. And that's where the explosion went right up the hill and took out entire neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And so if you know what you're looking for today, you can still see evidence of it. And my son's a Navy diver. He's posted to Halifax.
Oh, nice.
And he says when you dive in Halifax Harbor, the amount of unexploded ordnance that you can still see down there, and some of it may still be from Mont Blanc. I'm not positive, but who
Yeah,
knows?
yeah. You never know. Wow. So she sees out the war, though. And then
Yep.
what happens?
Yeah, so she sees out the war. By, 1918, HMCS Canada has put on a lot of miles and has seen better days, but still functional ship. But then by 1919, the war ends November 1918. Canada has a surplus of warships, as does everyone, and she's still kept by the Canadian government. She's decommissioned, or as we would properly say in Canada, she's paid off in 1919, so she's no longer a warship. She becomes a civilian ship under Canadian government ownership, and the Canadian government keeps her for another year, so the asking price is $20,000. There are no takers at $20,000. She sits around for a couple more years. Then the Canadian government decides, okay, we'll sell her for 10,000. And then there's a company out of Florida, but that decides, okay, for 10,000, we'll buy her. And finally, it's really a Florida-based company, but because ships that were registered through Britain, which CGS Canada was, British ships couldn't be sold to owners outside of the British Empire at the time.
Mhm.
And so basically, this Florida based company pretended to be out of the Bahamas. They registered a company at Nassau in the Bahamas. Things don't change much. And
Okay.
all of a sudden, it's a Bahamian company, and Bahamas at the time was still a British colony. So the sale went through to this Bahamian company, Inter-Island Steamship Company, which is really owned by a group of businessmen in southern Florida. And so then she's sent to the Bahamas, and then the owners changed the name to the SS Queen of Nassau because she's now providing a first-class passenger service between Nassau and the Bahamas to Miami. Miami at the time was starting to grow rapidly. It was becoming a very affluent city,
Mhm.
and that was built by a businessman named Henry Flagler, who brought the railroad down along the east coast of Florida, founds Palm Beach, and then he runs the railroad down to Miami, and all this wealth starts coming down. And so Baron Gift Collier, this man who made his money in developing advertising for streetcars, he starts developing the West Coast. And so Baron Gift Collier bought HMCS Canada.
Mm.
And his vision is that he's going to open up this market,
Right.
opening up the Caribbean, West Indian leisure market. And so not only is HMCS Canada important in regards to being Canada's first warship, surviving the Halifax Explosion and so on, but she's also used as basically the first ship to try and open up steamship travel to the West Indies and open up West Indian tourism. So she's converted from being a warship
Right.
to a first-class passenger ship. It's supposed to make the run, I believe, in 12 hours from Miami to Nassau.
Mhm.
And what happens was, yes, the ship can do 22 knots, which is very quick. Trouble is, she has to slow down in Bahamian waters because the waters are shallow.
Yeah.
And so now this adds, I think, an extra 6 hours onto the trip. So instead of becoming a day trip from Miami to Nassau, you now have to have an overnight vessel. And she's not built to accommodate passengers overnight. So very quickly, 2 other ships put her out of business.
Right.
And she's then laid up for 18 months in Biscayne Bay, which is that bay by Miami.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know from buying British submarines, you don't lay up a ship inactive for a long period of time in salt water.
No. You
And
have to wind up buying German submarines then.
yes. So finally, Collier manages to sell her to Mexican business interests who want to convert her into a ferry between Tampico on the Gulf of Mexico coast of Mexico to New Orleans. So the idea was to sail the Queen of Nassau from Miami around the Florida Keys up to Tampa, where she would go through her final inspection and then be converted into ferry service between Mexico and New Orleans. On the way down from Miami, she's starting to have some engine problems. She hasn't been used for 18 months. 80 kilometers south of Miami off a lower Metacombi Key in the Florida Keys, she starts taking on a lot of water. Then all of a sudden, the water really starts gushing in. The engineer goes up to the captain and says, "We're really starting to flood very rapidly now." In a very short period of time, the captain decides to abandon ship. And 20 minutes after they abandon ship, HMCS Canada sinks. And so she sinks stern first. So first she pops up a bit, the bow pops out of the water, and then she slides straight down. There wasn't any loss of crew. Everyone survived. She sank 7 miles, almost 11 kilometers offshore from Lower Metacombi Key. They make it to shore that night, and they're picked up the next day. She sank July 2nd, 1926. So Thursday of last week was her 100th anniversary of her sinking.
Wow.
So this is a key time to remember this ship on her 100th anniversary.
So tell us what you guys then did last year.
I'm in Key Largo, probably 2015 thereabouts, and I'm speaking to my contact there, Brenda Altmeyer, and she points to this poster on the wall of her office, and she said, "That ship used to be a Canadian flagship." And it's just the underwater, it's an underwater image that's been stitched together, looking from the top down. So you're looking at the upper deck of what turns out to be HMCS Canada. And I thought, really? First of all, I'd never heard of HMCS Canada. And at the time, certainly if it was up to 2015, I was still an officer in the Royal Canadian Navy. It was before I retired. And so being a historian, a Royal Canadian naval officer, it was like, wow, really? I've got to find out more about this. And then it just struck me that last year would be the 115th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Navy. And because people like years that end in 0 or 5.
Exactly.
I thought, okay, 115th anniversary, I'm going to lead an expedition to this ship. And she's down quite deep. She's down 235 feet, so that means you're going down with technical divers. It's not regular scuba. Regular scuba sort of ends at 140 feet. And then past that, you really need more advanced training. Initially, it was just, we'll go down on May 4th. May 4th is the anniversary date of the RCN. We'll unfurl the Royal Canadian Navy flag in front of it, which actually I have here, and take some photographs, and that would be it. And then I start speaking with one of Brenda's colleagues, Matt Lawrence, who's also an underwater archaeologist with NOAA in the Florida Keys, with the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And he said, yeah, why don't you do photogrammetry of the ship, and then we can use the ship for ecological studies and for underwater archaeology and for heritage conservation in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And sounds like a great idea. Little did I realize that I'd never done fundraising before for an expedition. I've always been part of an expedition doing the logistical planning and so on, but someone else has come up with the money, right?
Yeah.
So I quickly jumped onto this. Yeah, what a great idea this is. And so initially, my partner on this was going to be Jill Heinrich, who I believe you know.
Yeah.
And Jill is second to none in the dive world. And
Absolutely,
she's more than qualified for this type of work. And so she was quite keen on it. And then so for about a year, we start pulling this together. And then unfortunately, and this is public knowledge, she's mentioned it. So Jill
She had a
developed
cancer scare.
cancer.
Yeah. Yeah.
couldn't take part in the expedition. But she said, I know this guy who would have been on the expedition, Guy Shockey out on Vancouver Island. I'll recommend him to replace me. And so she did. And Guy pulled together a team, him and 5 other divers, all technical divers. Rob DeProy, who's from Vancouver Island. Rob DeProy used to be the senior dive coxswain for
Mhm.
the Royal Canadian Navy in Esquimalt, so a lot of experience. Jason Cook, another technical diver from Vancouver Island. And then Roger Lacasse. Roger's from Montreal. He was our 3D photogrammetry expert. Again, an outstanding technical diver. So there were the 6 of us. And then for the 7th member was Kelvin Davidson, who's a New Zealander who now lives in Tulum, Mexico. And everyone just worked together. Everyone knew what their role would be. First of all, we were supposed to go in May of last year. I couldn't raise the money by May. Anyhow, by the summer, last summer, I did manage to raise the money. So we went last December, and, like I said, it was down to 135 feet, so that's 70 meters, around 57 meters, so around 187 feet. It becomes quite murky and milky and becomes a challenge to film. Normally you've got about 20 feet, so 6 meters of visibility, but you don't have good contrast. And to do 3D photogrammetry, you need really good contrast. We had 4 days of diving. The first 2 days, the currents were strong. The 7-mile trip out on the boat it was a challenge keeping one's breakfast down. And,
Yeah.
but anyhow, we all did. So we got out there. You drift dive down because of the currents. You have multiple currents on that area. And so you drift dive down on an angle to the wreck,
Mm.
not straight down because of the currents. So again, the captain had to position our dive boat. We had a 30-foot dive boat away from the wreck, and then everyone had to jump when told to. So we had 3 2-man teams. And so when the captain gave the order to dive, the 2-man team would go and dive quickly. And that's challenging because not only are you carrying Roger, the dive sled with the cameras, the lights, and which is attached to, I'll use layman's terms, like an underwater scooter.
Mhm.
You have to get the diver in, then you have to hand that sled to him. Then the second diver goes in. Each diver is carrying about 300 pounds of
Woo.
equipment,
Yeah.
technical dive equipment and everything. And then you're on a rocky boat. So the biggest fear is falling sideways and snapping your knees,
Yeesh.
right? So on the one hand, you've got a lot of wave action. You've got the captain positioning the boat like we had. This was a big no-no, but anyhow, our anchor hit the boat. The ship hit
Oh, no.
HMCS Canada, and we did have a buoy on the top, a big balloon, so we could at least follow the rope down to HMCS Canada. So he would have to judge the currents on the surface, the boat's captain, who is a local, Jeff Knapp. So Jeff had to judge where the drift would start and where to position the boat to get the divers off. Then you have to get the divers off, making sure that they weren't hurt and none of the equipment was damaged. And then they drifted down, and everything was timed very precisely.
All those challenges, though, Joe, were there moments where you're able to be like, wow, I'm in front of this ship now? Is there?
Yeah, I'm not a technical diver, so I didn't go past 140 feet on
Right.
this. My role was more like if there was an emergency.
Yeah.
I did go down. I got to go down along the rope for a while, and then I had to stop because I reached my limit and looked down into the abyss.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could see that milky white. You could just see the rope disappearing.
Amazing.
But the other guys, yeah, they were just fascinated by this whole thing, getting down to the ship and knowing this was Canada's first warship, knowing what it meant to Canada. Four of us of the 7 were retired Canadian Armed Forces members.
Hmm.
The history meant a lot, but even to the 3 members of the crew who weren't, the history of what it meant to Canada, it really meant a lot to everyone. But yeah, all of us, including myself, going into the waters like this with strong currents, murkiness, whatever, one, it's your training. Secondly, it's your state of mind. You don't do this type of thing unless you feel comfortable doing it. And so all 7 of us, but especially the 6 who were down on the ship every day, everyone was trained to do this type of thing. So it wasn't a concern from that point of view.
What an amazing expedition. What an amazing to have found this ship that I think many Canadians don't know anything about, and to bring it back into the light. And what is your hope that the legacy is now going forward? What is the future for
Greater
HMCS
understanding that HMCS Canada even existed, because even a lot of people in the Royal Canadian Navy, including myself, with my degrees in history and so on, and as in for a 27-year period, I had no idea that HMCS Canada existed. So it's really bringing more visibility for that part of Canadian history. Also, NOAA can use this for heritage conservation, marine archaeology. But there are 2 things that we actually found. First of all, Canada sinks because, and we're like 99% sure, and NOAA even came up with this conclusion back in the early 2000s, is because the drive shaft for the starboard propeller snaps, slides out of the housing, and then the housing allows water to come into the ship. And it's a 11-inch diameter. So that's a big opening for water to come in. And that's why initially she's sinking slowly. The engineer mentions there's water under the boiler room coming up. Then all of a sudden, it pops up to 2 feet of water. The drive shaft and the starboard propeller slide away. And when you go on our 3D photogrammetry model, you'll see on the starboard side, it's gone. Whereas on this port side, the propeller's still there. So that was reconfirmed. And plus, we were able to develop clearer photography, imagery of the ship, because we were using 2025 technology. They were using 2001 to 2003 technology, and the technology for this has really advanced over the last 2 decades. Secondly, the captain and the crew of the ship, when they were interviewed by the Miami newspaper, said when the ship went up and then she started to sink, there was an explosion. So they had assumed the boiler room had exploded and that the ship's hull had crumpled. In the 3 NOAA surveys of the ship didn't find any exterior hull evidence of the ship boilers exploding, and nor is there anywhere where the hull is crumpled. So in the 2005 report by Tane Casserly, the NOAA underwater archaeologist, he makes reference to the fact they didn't see any evidence of the boiler explosion nor the hull being crushed. So in our expedition, because of the 3D photogrammetry, and also while Roger was down there with the dive sled taking the imagery, he did notice cracks. And when he put the model together, he did find that indeed there were cracks on the starboard side and on the port side in the same place by the engine room. So yes, the engine did explode once the salt water hit it. So the steam boilers did explode, forced the ship out a bit, but the account of the ship, the hull being crushed, that was not the case. We were able to prove that, yes, actually the boilers did explode. So from an underwater archaeology point of view, we contributed. From a marine biology, ecology point of view, we contributed to scientific knowledge. And then Canadian point of view, you're interviewing me for this. Last week, CBC interviewed me. There have been magazine articles on it. Our goal, in addition to scientific contribution, is making this ship better known. That actually wasn't HMCS Niobe, which was Canada's first warship, or modern era warship, was actually HMCS Canada.
Listen, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and illuminating this story. As you say, most Canadians don't know this story, and it's a story worth hearing.
Well, thank you, and have a good day.
And thanks to all of you for listening. Joe's next expedition in 2027 is to the shipwrecks sunk by German U-boat attacks in the Second World War off of Newfoundland's Bell Island. You can hear more about those Bell Island wrecks in episode 60 of the podcast, featuring Joe's sometime collaborator, the RCGS Explorer in Residence and Hall of Fame diver, Joe Heinerth. It's a fascinating dive, pun intended, into Newfoundland's World War II history. Check it out. Did you know Canadian Geographic is a national magazine award winner? It happens pretty much every year, and this year was no exception. Congratulations to everyone involved. And that's simply because CanGeo is one of Canada's best magazines, as well as being the #1 paid subscription magazine in the country. You can get a subscription for just $28.50, which will get you 6 print issues delivered to you, as well as unlimited digital access to the full Canadian Geographic archives. It's a great value and a great way to support Canadian storytelling in this elbows up era. To sign up, go to cangeo.ca/subscribe. You'll be very happy that you did. Also, it makes a great gift. That's it for this episode of Explore. If you liked it, be sure to share the link with friends and family and give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Your review could get read in an upcoming episode. Until next time, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people
We
about
left Simpson about June 10th with the Fur Brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp fish swimming around outside. It's just fabulous here.
Well, I'm a first for Canada.